Batman Begins was released on June 15th, 2005, and marks the fifth entry in the Batman film series. However, this entry would be a total reboot of the Batman series due to the absolute travesty that was Batman and Robin. Now, if you notice, I didn't review Batman and Robin for my Batman series reviews, and I'm not going to review that film because it's a complete disaster. It's pure trash, and it would be a waste of your time and mine to just even go over that. So, in short, it's one of the worst films ever made, and the only good thing that came out of it was that it was so awful that it led to the creation of the masterpiece known as Batman Begins. Batman Begins is one of my absolute favorites in the Batman series, and I'll never forget the day I was walking through the lobby in the cinema because I like to walk around and look at the various movie posters for upcoming releases, and at the time, I didn't have internet at my home. So, anyway, I'll never forget the day I was walking through the lobby and saw the poster for Batman Begins. Initially, I rolled my eyes at the notion of a fifth Batman film, primarily due to how awful Batman and Robin was. But when I checked to see who was directing and featuring in the film, I became completely ecstatic. What? The guy who directed Memento is going to make a Batman movie? This is going to be great, I thought. What? Liam Neeson, Morgan Freeman, Michael Kane, and Christian Bale are going to be in a Batman movie? These are great actors, is what I thought. This was all it took for me to know that this was going to be a great film, and boy, was I right. In fact, simply saying Batman Begins is a great film is an understatement. For me, it's not only one of the greatest comic book films of all time, but possibly up there on the list of one of the best. This film really spoke to me at the time because of the themes of conquering the fear within oneself. The best thing about Batman Begins is that we finally get a movie centered entirely on Bruce Wayne rather than on the villains, which was mildly attempted in Batman Forever. But with this film, we finally break out of Gotham City and take the story to a global scale, and we get to spend a significant amount of time with Bruce Wayne's character like we never had before in film. Furthermore, and most importantly, we finally get to see the origins of Batman, something that wasn't even fully explored in the comics, which is just outright amazing and why I consider this film one of the best. Up to this point, the only explanations for Batman's origins were from the comics in which his parents were murdered, and all we knew is that he disappeared for nearly a decade and traveled the world to train his body and spirit, and that he briefly trained with a man named Ducard. And all this was seen in the comic The Man Who Falls. And other details we got from Frank Miller's Batman Year One graphic novel. So, for this film to truly take it upon itself to elaborate step by step how Batman came to be was amazing. In addition, taking this mysterious and lesser known character called Ducard and combining him with Raz Al Ghul's character in order to make Raz Batman's mentor and worst enemy was absolutely brilliant writing from David S. Goyer, who also wrote another comic book movie masterpiece, Blade, with Wesley Snipes. I cannot praise this creative decision enough, and I think it really illustrated that Goyer truly knows the source material and that he was artistic and smart enough to synthesize these two characters in order to tell such an amazing story for such an amazing film. Now, when I found out that Batman was going to be played by Christian Bale, I thought it was an excellent casting decision because I loved his work in American Psycho, and even when he was a young boy in Steven Spielberg's Empire of the Sun. I felt that Christian Bale had the look of Bruce Wayne and Batman, and I could totally imagine him as a conflicted and self loathing type of character. And I could also imagine him with the cowl on his face. Now, I just want to speak briefly about the score to this film. And I know I'm going to get a lot of people that disagree with me, but I am not a fan of Hans Zimmer's soundtrack. I really found it to be bland and a little boring and forgettable. In comparison with Danny Elfman's and even the person that did the film score for Batman Forever and even the film score from the Batman 2022, I find Hans Zimmer's soundtrack for the entire Dark Knight trilogy to be uninspiring and just forgettable. I mean, for the life of me, I cannot hum to you a Batman theme from any scene from any of these films from the Dark Knight trilogy that Hans Zimmer has done. I'm just not a fan of it. And that's not a slight against Hans Zimmer because I like his work in Dune and I like his work in Interstellar and in Days of Thunder, but when it comes to the Batman, the Dark Knight trilogy, I'm just not a fan and I don't know what to say. And I know a lot of people love his work, especially for the Dark Knight trilogy, but I have to disagree. I'm just not into it at all. I find it unmemorable. If I had a single word to describe Hans Zimmer's music for the Dark Knight trilogy, it's unmemorable. Sorry, people, but that's honestly how I feel. Now, our story begins in Gotham City briefly, and basically, Bruce Wayne, as a young boy, falls down a well and is attacked by a swarm of bats which caused him to develop a deep rooted fear of him. And this sets the tone for the film where Bruce is going to have to conquer the fear within himself. And I really, really enjoy that theme. So Bruce awakens from this flashback and he's in a prison. So we see right away that Bruce's nightmares are worse than the actual prison that he's in because Bruce Wayne essentially is in his own prison, the prison of his fear, which we find out later has its origins not only in falling into that cave where the bats were, but also this guiltiness that he may be responsible for the deaths of his parents. Now, I really love this introduction to Bruce Wayne in this prison because we really get this sense that this film is going to be so much grander in scale than the previous Batman entries. I mean, here we are in this region of the world that feels like it's almost in Tibet or Nepal or something like that, and immediately you know that you are in for a novel experience. Now, in the prison, after Bruce Wayne just literally gets into this big prison fight and kicks everyone's ass, he's put into a prison cell in isolation, and there he meets Henry Ducard, who is actually Raz Al Ghul, but if you're watching this film for the first time, you don't know that. So he meets Ducard, who basically recruits Bruce Wayne into the League of Shadows, which is led by a decoy version of Raz Al Ghul. But it's actually this Ducard character that is the real Raz. So we get a lot of back and forth between flashbacks and the present day where Ducard is actually training Bruce Wayne. And these training sequences are some of my favorite sequences in the entire film. The chemistry between Liam Neeson and Christian Bale is outstanding. They have a great, great relationship. And I truly believe that there is some sort of apprenticeship going on here. And Ducard, basically, he goes to Bruce Wayne. He recruits Bruce Wayne because he knows that they share this mutual hatred of evil. And Ducard, Raz rather, knows that he has this potential that he can aid him with, that he could basically teach him how to be a more effective battler or fighter against evil. But he has to tell him, he has to teach him that he has to be more than a man. He has to become an ideal. And I love that idea. And he knows that he seeks to turn fear on those who prey on the fearful. That's what Bruce Wayne says, but he's not at that point yet because Bruce Wayne's his fear is what is holding him back. So Raz, Ducard, whatever you want to call him, is basically going to teach him how to defeat his own fear. In other words, now Liam Neeson does an outstanding job at playing Raz Al Ghul. His mentorship of Bruce Wayne was well written, and it was great initially introducing him as Ducard and having him train Bruce and making Bruce believe that Ducard was an apprentice to a false Raz Al Ghul who dies, only for Raz to return as Ducard, claiming that Raz is immortal, which was a great way to pay tribute to the comics in which Raz uses the Lazarus pits to become immortal while keeping Raz grounded in his real-world version of Batman in this film. Now, as Ducard is training Bruce Wayne, we get flashbacks of a young Bruce Wayne attending the opera with his parents. And here, Bruce becomes frightened by the performers because of the themes of bats. And this is basically reminding him of his trauma that he encountered when he fell into the cave and was overwhelmed by a swarm of bats. Now, because he asks his parents to leave the opera, outside, a mugger murders Bruce Wayne's parents in front of him, and the orphan Bruce Wayne is comforted by Commissioner Gordon. Well, he's not the commissioner yet, James Gordon, and this was a very touching scene, and he is basically going to be raised by Alfred. Now, in regards to Alfred, Michael Kane, Michael Kane is the best version of Alfred ever put to screen. His portrayal of Alfred is so much more personal than the version we saw in the Tim Burton, Joel Schumacher films. Michael Caine's Alfred is very compassionate and fatherly to Bruce, and he is so much more than Bruce's butler. You truly feel that this version of Alfred truly worries about the well-being and mental health of Bruce Wayne. And in regards to Gary Oldman's performance as James Gordon, it was great and such a better depiction of how James Gordon is in the comics, especially the graphic novel Batman Year One. Now, I say that when compared to the previous version of Jim Gordon that we saw in the Burton Schumacher interpretations. Gary Oldman, who up to this point in time was primarily known for his portrayal of villains, does an outstanding job at playing the compassionate and ethical and moral Jim Gordon. Gary Oldman truly illustrates his range as an actor with this role. Now, I really love the dialogue that Bruce Wayne's father tells him when he falls into the cave. And it basically sets the theme that is present throughout the entire film, and it's why do we fall? So we can pick ourselves up, which translates into basically we learn from our failures and not to give up simply because you failed. And Bruce, at this point in the flashback, he considers the notion that if he hadn't wanted to leave the opera house, maybe his parents wouldn't have died. And he begins to blame himself for his parents' death. And basically, Alfred comforts him. And it's a very touching scene. And also, Gordon comforting little Bruce was a good way to introduce the character. And apparently, they catch the murderer of Bruce Wayne's parents, Joe Chill, And I thought that was a little interesting because in the comic books, they never caught the murder, but they did in the film. And, it's a artistic decision, something novel to the Batman universe up to this point. So I thought that was very interesting. And the turn of events as to what happens was also interesting because apparently 14 years later, the murderer of Bruce Wayne's parents is paroled after testifying against mafia boss Carmine Falcone. Now, Bruce, he intends to murder the killer of his parents, and all this stuff is new stuff, man. None of this is in the comics. This was created solely for this film, and it was kind of a bold decision, but it works for the story. Now, instead of Bruce succeeding in killing the murderer of his parents, what actually happens is Carmine Falcone's assassin ends up killing Joe Chill first. And once Bruce's childhood friend, who is a lawyer, Rachel Dawes, finds out, she totally just goes off on him. And I have something to really say about that because I I love this movie. I really do. But the character of Rachel was very frustrating, and she was probably the only thing that I didn't like about this film. And what I really didn't like about her character is that she is just excessively idealistic to the point where I just don't understand how Bruce Wayne can continue to be friends with her. I mean, I just wanted to strangle her because she lacked no empathy for Bruce. She's actually instead empathetic to the guy that killed Bruce Wayne's parents because he snitched on Falcone. How can she not understand how Bruce is feeling? How can she not understand his sentiment of wanting to kill the guy that killed his parents? I mean, it's not like she's condoning the actual murder, but just understanding the sentiment is what I'm trying to say. Like, sure, I understand her saying, like, hey, killing him is wrong, but for Bruce Wayne to sit there and be like, oh man, I'm glad that he's dead, and for her to be like, no, you don't mean that. It's like, what? Like, what? I just don't get it. She's like, I hate her. She's a dumb character for not having empathy for this sentiment that Bruce Wayne is glad the murderer of his parents are dead. She tries to paint this larger picture in regards to Falcone's influence on crime in the city, but still, the way she treats Bruce like he's some little boy and him actually feeling good that the guy that murdered his parents got what was coming to him and treating it like it's like him feeling that way is infantile is ridiculous. And then her saying his father would have been ashamed of him. It's like, oh, shut up. And it's ironic. In the long run, of course, it's ironic that Bruce was going to kill Joe Chill and somebody else did it for him, and he still feels empty inside. I understand what the scene is trying to do, and it accomplishes that. It's just that in regards to Rachel, I just totally don't like. And you know what? It's justified because at the end of the film, she apologizes for this. So there's a little bit of closure in regards to this. And I think that the writers of the story were trying to make Rachel excessively idealistic and annoying. And they did a good job because when she was basically lacking no empathy for Bruce and having no understanding of the sentiment and just her playing all high and mighty, oh my God. I wanted to strangle her. I wanted to strangle her. Like, I don't like Rachel Dawes. The best thing about her, as far as Dark Knight, was that she got killed. It was great. Rachel dying was amazing. I hate Rachel. But I'm not saying that that's a reason to not like this film or that I knock this film a couple of points down because I don't like her character. I think that was the intent because she really is excessively idealistic to the point of insanity. Now, in regards to some of this training with Raz Al Ghul, I love the instruction that Liam Neeson is giving here. The fear of the reality that Bruce is possibly responsible for his father's death is his true fear. And Raz is showing this to Bruce. And Bruce saying that his anger outweighs his guilt just shows that he's truly angry at himself. And I love Raz, his statement when he says that criminals thrive on the indulgence of society's understanding. And I totally feel like that's relevant today. And the training sequences are outstanding when they're on the ice. Brilliant. Great swordplay, great instruction. This stuff is legendary right here. And I love when he's training him in the sword fighting and he tells him his father is the reason why he died, not yours. It's not Bruce Wayne's fault. His father was responsible because he failed to act, the will to act. And I love that stuff. And then we have this great line of dialogue once Bruce is tricked by Raz and he falls into the ice and they're sitting by the fire and Raz recollects his wife being killed. And he has that recollection of losing his beloved wife, and he uses this as fuel for vengeance. And this is just like the comic, because in the comic books, Raz loses his wife, and this becomes his fuel for vengeance. Of course, the execution is entirely different, but I really appreciate that they kept that. They kept that important character trait in there. And I love how he says, the memory of our loved ones turns into poison in our veins, and you catch yourself wishing that the person you love never existed just so you could be spared your pain. That was some powerful stuff right there. It truly was. And then we see Bruce Wayne in another flashback basically having this sentiment of wanting to demolish Wayne Manor because of how painful the memories are. And Alfred basically admonishes him over that. And again, it's just illustrating Alfred's love for the character, like a fatherly figure. And I love how Alfred, he can't tell him what to do about his past, but he illustrates that he cares about what he does with his future. And he admonishes him because this is the legacy of his family, the Waynes. And he feels like Bruce Wayne fails to see the importance of that as far as this point in time in the film. So after being admonished by Rachel for basically having the gun and attempting to kill the murderer of his parents, and basically learning that Falcone is responsible for killing the murderer of his parents, he goes to confront Falcone. Bruce does. So Bruce goes to confront Falcone, and it's a great scene. And Falcone basically treats him like a spoiled, privileged little brat that has no concept or no idea of what true loss and true desperation is. And Falcone tells him that real power comes from being feared. And he kicks him out of the nightclub. And Bruce then spends the next 7 years traveling the world, training in combat, and immersing himself in the criminal underworld. And that leads us up to the present moment in which Raz is basically instructing Bruce Wayne in the League of Shadows. So, what ultimately happens is after completing his training in the methods of the ninja and purging his fears, and I really love the sequence where Bruce inhales that flower, the toxin from the flower, in order to hallucinate. And this is where we get some really outstanding direction from Christopher Nolan. I mean, it's just amazing. Christopher Nolan's direction is highly sophisticated and impeccable. Every shot is well composed, and the actors give excellent performances. Nolan's version of Batman feels like it's much more rooted in reality when compared to Tim Burton's and Joel Schumacher's versions, which had a significant amount of fantasy elements. There were certain aspects of this film, and this is why I bring it up because of these hallucinating moments. And the portions of this film that had those, it felt like I was watching an art house type of film, especially the sequences where we get into the psyche of the characters and we see fear, the fear through their eyes, what they fear. A perfect example of this is the toxins, and when Scarecrow uses his fear toxin and it's inhaled, and it's like art house mixed with French surrealism because the images are it can go any way. It's no longer basically confined by reality because the fears are so animated and so out there, and I really love that. We've never seen anything like that in a Batman film, and there hasn't been again since, because there was nothing like that in Dark Knight or The Dark Knight Rises or in the Batman 2022. And another thing that I really appreciate about Nolan's Batman films is that they feel so much bigger than the previous entries in the Batman series because we finally get out of Gotham City and see other parts of the world. This was especially necessary to introduce a character like Raz Al Ghul and the League of Shadows, a characters whose origins are rooted among Chinese nomads and the northern parts of Africa. Now, Raz Al Ghul is Arabic for the head of the demon or the head of the ghoul. And I just wanted to throw that in there. So, yes, I love this sequence with Raz Al Ghul instructing Bruce Wayne to use the hallucinogenics in order to journey inwards to conquer the fear within himself. And he tells him, to conquer fear, you must become fear. And I love how that little detail that it's actually this same herb that is going to be used in Scarecrow's toxin. So you have that link from the League of Shadows to the Scarecrow character later on in the film. And I love how Roz instructs Bruce Wayne that in order to become fear, in order to become scary, in other words, you have to become a terrible thought. You have to become an idea. That was excellent. Really great stuff right there. Now, after completing his training in the ninja methods and purging his inner fears, Bruce learns that the League of Shadows knows about Gotham, and basically their intention is to destroy Gotham because they believe that Gotham City is beyond saving, and Bruce rejects this idea when he's basically forced to execute a criminal. So Bruce refuses to execute this criminal because he feels like there is that fine line. If he crosses that line and becomes an executioner, a murderer, that he is no different than the enemies he is trying to defeat, in other words. And I love Ra's al Ghul's dialogue right here. He says, your compassion will be used against you, and it's a sentiment that your enemies will not share. And then Bruce counters that by saying that's why it's so important, because it separates us from them. As a result of refusing to kill that criminal, to execute the criminal, Bruce Wayne has no other choice but to rebel against the League of Shadows. So he fights against the League of Shadows, and it's presumed that Ra's al Ghul is dead because basically the ceiling collapses on him. But that's not the real Ra's al Ghul. And Bruce Wayne decides to save Ducard, not knowing that it's truly Ra's al Ghul. And it was such an awesome sequence and an awesome stunt when they're escaping the building that is basically the League of Shadows organization, their hideout, whatever, once it's collapsing on them. And then that awesome stunt when Ducard, Raz, is about to fall off the cliff, and Bruce basically just uses his arm, one arm, to cling himself to the edge of the cliff, and then uses his other arm to haul Raz Al Ghul up. And you could tell that it was painful lifting him up, and it was just such a great action sequence and such a great uh, stunt. Awesome stuff right there. So after this sequence, Bruce decides to return back to Gotham in order to fight crime. So that's his intention, to take on crime. And Bruce takes an interest, in addition to the family's company, Wayne Enterprises, which is basically being taken public by the CEO, or whatever you want to call William Earl. Now, here, Bruce is also introduced to Lucius Fox, played by Morgan Freeman, the great Morgan Freeman. And I love this character, Lucius Fox. I love Morgan Freeman. Who doesn't love Morgan Freeman? It's always nice to see him in any role. And he has such a classy on-screen appeal. And I love seeing him play this type of James Bond Q figure to Bruce Wayne, providing him all of this awesome and innovative gadgets and equipment. And that is one thing that I can honestly say about the Christopher Nolan Batman films, is that there's this James Bond vibe to them. Maybe it's his British sensibilities that he's bringing to the table, but I love it nonetheless because I'm also a huge James Bond fan as well as a Batman fan. So yes, Lucius Fox acts like Q does to James Bond, and he allows Bruce access to all these different types of prototype defense technologies, including his armored suit and a heavily armored vehicle called the Tumbler, which is going to turn into the Batmobile. And I love the Tumbler. So different from the Batmobiles that we got in the Joel Schumacher, Tim Burton Batman movies, which I liked. But I like the Tumbler also, is what I'm trying to say. And I'm glad that they weren't afraid to try something different, because the Tumbler is like a tank. And even one of the cops says that after getting ran over by the thing in his vehicle. It's like a tank. And I thought that was awesome. So while Bruce returns to Gotham, he also starts posing like he's some shallow playboy, while simultaneously setting up the Batcave with all his gadgets and his resources and all that awesome stuff. And I thought it was great to see Bruce Wayne go back into the cave where he had that trauma as a young boy and confront all the bats. And it was such an awesome sequence to see him standing there, fearless, as all the bats swarm all around him. And I also like seeing Batman in this preliminary phase in his career getting all beat up, especially when he tries to, basically when he communicates to Gordon to basically communicate with Rachel Dawes, because she's a honest player in the game. She's an honest lawyer. She could be trusted. And he jumps from that rooftop onto that fire escape and gets all beat up. Great stuff, man. It really makes you feel like this is real world events going down. This is not a Batman taking place in a fantasy world. This is Batman grounded. And I appreciated that. And that's not a slight against Tim Burton's Batman, because I love that too. It's just great to have diversity as far as different interpretations of the character. And now that Bruce Wayne has returned to Gotham, he's obviously going to eventually encounter Rachel. And here is where I start to feel a little bit better about the Rachel character. I don't hate her as much as our initial introduction to her, when she was just insanely idealistic to the point of you just want to strangle her. It's a great sequence to see her interpret Bruce Wayne as basically just being uncaring and being this reckless playboy and having Bruce feel guilty about it and say, underneath, I am more. And then she says to him, it's not who you are underneath, it's what you do that defines you. And it's like, ooh, ouch. And here, Bruce has a conflict. He has a character conflict. And basically, he's torn by Bruce Wayne and the Batman character. Bruce Wayne has to depict himself in a certain manner as this carefree billionaire playboy. And deep down inside, he knows what he really wants, which is to be Batman full time if he could be. But at the same time, he cannot operate without also being Bruce Wayne. Now, I know I said initially that I hated the character Rachel, but let's just talk about Katie Holmes' acting. Now, she does a decent job. Now, the character Rachel Dawes was specifically created for this film. She's not in the comics or anything like that. But ultimately, I feel like Katie Holmes delivers a bland performance, in my opinion. And again, I'm very indifferent to both the character and her performance. And again, I find her irritating at the very least because of her excessively idealistic nature when it comes to the criminal justice system. And I don't know, but I think that this was intentional. But she's definitely my least favorite love interest for Batman out of the entire Batman film series. And I find her character to be pretty irritating and also pretty boring and uninteresting. And I feel like she leaves little to no impression on me as a viewer outside of irritation. And again, this observation in no way brings the film down for me because I feel like it was probably intentional. Because again, later on in the film, she apologizes for that initial lack of empathy towards Bruce Wayne when his parents' murderer was killed. Now, once Bruce Wayne gets all the great equipment to become Batman, and there's an awesome sequence where he basically forcefully interrogates this corrupt cop. And this is where you truly see Christian Bale step into this character when he's like, swear to me. And you just see how terrified this corrupt cop is of Batman. That was so awesome. And that's where you're fully into it and you fully tell yourself, okay, Christian Bale knows what he's doing, and this guy is definitely a great Batman. That was awesome stuff. So, Batman is fully operational and he intercepts a drug shipment, and Batman provides Rachel with evidence against Falcone in relation to this drug shipment, and he asks for help from James Gordon, who is obviously Gotham's probably only loyal and honest cop, and he basically wants Jim Gordon to set out in order to bring Falcone down. Now, Falcone gets arrested, and in prison, or in the Arkham Asylum rather, he encounters Dr. Jonathan Crane, a corrupt psychologist, and basically who is Scarecrow. Now, I think Cillian Murphy did an excellent job as Scarecrow. He was perfectly casted as Scarecrow, and he totally sells the role of a corrupt, unethical, insane psychologist who enjoys instilling fear into his patients for his own experiments and pleasure. That was great casting, and they did a great job in executing the character of Scarecrow. Now, once Falcone encounters Scarecrow, we learn that they're basically working together. Falcone is well aware of the League of Shadows. He's not aware of their true intentions, but you see that they're working together. And once Falcone threatens to turn on Crane, he basically sprays him with the fear inducing hallucinogenic that drives Falcone insane. And he's then just fully 5150, man. The guy's just totally insane now. And while investigating Jonathan Crane, Scarecrow's basically uh, relations with Falcone and investigating his crimes, Batman is also sprayed with the hallucinogen. And we have this great sequence. And again, it just feels like something out of a French surrealism film because we see all the hallucinations that Batman's having, the fear, and it's just awesome stuff. Great editing, and Batman is just terrified because he's been sprayed with the hallucinogen and he's set on fire by Scarecrow, but he is able to escape and he's saved by Alfred and Luscious Fox, who develops an antidote for the hallucinogen. Now, when Rachel Dawes accuses Jonathan Crane of corruption, he reveals to her that basically the whole plan that Raz Al Ghul and the League of Shadows are up to, which is that he basically put his hallucinogenic fear drug into Gotham City's water supply. Crane then drugs Rachel with the hallucinogen, and we next have this sequence where Batman subdues John Crane and sprays him with his own fear inducing drug. And again, we get more of that French surrealism, crazy special effects. And I love the sequence where John Scarecrow perceives Batman to be this demonic face, and he's basically asking him, "Where's Raz Al Ghul?" And that was just so awesome. I'll never forget how blown away I was in the theater seeing that, because again, this was just a total novel experience when it came to the Batman films up to this point, and ever since I've never seen anything like it. It was awesome the way that they used this hallucinogenic fear inducing drug as an opportunity to mess with editing and special effects and the perception of not only the characters but the audience too. That demonic face was so awesome. That was great. And then Batman ultimately has to escape the asylum in order to save Rachel from the fear inducing drug that Jonathan Crane sprayed her with. And we get this awesome action sequence, which is the escape from the asylum. And this is totally taken out of the graphic novel Batman Year One. I love the way he uses that sound device that only the bats are attracted to in order to escape from the police. That was such a great sequence. Now, it's important to note that during Batman's interrogation of John Crane, he tells him that he works for Raz Al Ghul. So this is a revelation to Batman, because up to this point, you have to remember, he thought Raz Al Ghul was dead. He thought the League of Shadows was finished. But John Crane reveals that they are still up to their plans, which is to destroy Gotham City for being beyond saving because they are too corrupt. The citizens of Gotham, that is. Now, after administering Rachel the antidote and giving her a vial of it in order for Jim Gordon to basically give to Luscious Vox for mass production, we have this sequence that takes place at Bruce's mansion at the Wayne Manor, and it's basically Bruce's birthday, and Ra's al Ghul and the League of Shadows decide to crash the party. And also, previously in the film, it was revealed that the League of Shadows stole a powerful microwave emitter from Wayne Enterprises, and they basically plan to use this microwave emitter in order to vaporize Gotham City's water supply, which has the fear inducing hallucinogenic drug that Scarecrow put into the water. And as a result of all this, mass hysteria is going to destroy Gotham City, and Ra's al Ghul basically wants to see Gotham City rip itself apart through fear. And there's a brief fight that goes down between the League of Shadows and Bruce Wayne, and Raz Al Ghul, who reveals to Bruce Wayne that he basically is the real Raz Al Ghul. So up to this point, Wayne thought Ducard was an entirely different person, but he is finally given the revelation that Ducard is the real Raz Al Ghul. So Raz leaves Bruce for dead in Wayne Manor as it gets burned down, and I have to say that I thought it was a bold move to burn down Wayne Manor, especially in the first Batman film for this reboot. So I thought that was a bold move and pretty daring artistically to do that. And Alfred ultimately ends up saving Bruce Wayne. And there was some great exchanges between Alfred and Bruce. Like before Bruce actually attends to the party, he doesn't even want to bother with it. And then you hear Alfred say to him, it's not just your name, it's your father's name. Because Bruce basically says, I don't care about my name, I don't care about the legacy. And Alfred admonishes him, telling him, don't destroy what's left of your father, which is his name. And I thought that was a great moment between the two, even though it's a conflict. But it's just great character development that we're seeing right here. And then we're shown that the League of Shadows and Raz Al Ghul are back and that they've been operating for hundreds of years, basically restoring balance to society by ransacking Rome and destroying numerous civilizations. I thought that was also interesting. And then, again, Alfred rescues Bruce, and like his father, he says to him, why do we fall? So that we can pick ourselves up. Because Bruce really felt like he failed, especially when Wayne Manor gets burned down. And again, this is showing never give up, learn through failure. I thought this was a brilliant moment between the two characters. So Raz then loads the microwave emitter onto Gotham's subway system in order to release the drug at the city's central water source. And ultimately, what goes down is there's mass hysteria going on. All the inmates of Arkham Asylum have been let loose. There's chaos going on in Gotham. And Batman rescues Rachel from a drugged mob. And there is some more of that French surrealist, crazy, hallucinogenic stuff going on. We see the hallucinations of Rachel because they've all breathed in that fear-inducing toxin because the microwave emitter starts to vaporize the water and it has the drug in it, the fear-inducing drug. And basically Scarecrow comes riding on horseback and he's depicted as a fire-breathing horse, angel of death thing, and it was just awesome. So he looks like the angel of death riding a fire-breathing horse, in other words. And I thought it was a brilliant visual. It was amazing. And then when Batman uses his cape to fly, he looks like a demon, literally just flying through the Gotham night sky. More great visuals and great editing. Awesome stuff. Now, Raz's plot totally seems like something that he would do. And he does stuff like this in the comics. In the comics, it was primarily weather, manipulation, technology being implemented. So for him to have this elaborate plot using Gotham City's water supply, it totally sounds like something that he would do. And Bruce Wayne, or Batman rather, fights Raz Al Ghul on the train as the microwave emitter is on its way to the Gotham City central water source. And the fight on the train was awesome. And then he throws something back at Raz Al Ghul that Raz said to him when he was instructing him way back when he was under the tutelage of Raz in Iceland or wherever they were. It was probably like Tibet or something. And he says, you don't mind your surroundings. You never learn to mind your surroundings. And I thought that was great, how he threw that back at him. And yes, the fight on the monorail, the subway, whatever, it was awesome. And while this goes down, Jim Gordon uses the Batmobile, the tumbler, in order to destroy a section of the track. So what ultimately happens is Batman refuses to kill Raz. He sticks to his ethics. And I love what he says to him. He says, I won't kill you, but I don't have to save you. And as a result of the train tracks being destroyed, the train is just going to plummet to the surface. It's not going to go into the central water source. Batman leaves, and Raz is basically left behind in order to just die in the destruction of the monorail system as it explodes once it impacts off the train tracks onto the surface. It was a great death for this character, and it also was a great act that Batman did. I love how he said, I don't have to kill you, but I'm not going to save you. That was awesome. And then after this, Batman obviously saved the day, and Bruce gains Rachel's respect and love, and she knows that Bruce is Batman because when Rachel said it's not who we are underneath that counts, it's what we do. Basically, he says that to her. Batman says that to her. And then she immediately knows that Batman is actually Bruce Wayne. And it's right here that Rachel does apologize for being an idiot earlier in the movie when she just totally lacked empathy for the sentiment that Bruce had when he was glad that his parents' murderer was dead. So she does apologize for that, and and I appreciated that. But it's important to note that I really feel like these two actors, um, Katie Holmes and Christian Bale, they really don't have that much chemistry. I mean, I really don't feel the vibe between them. I mean, it's not awful, but again, I just really don't like the Rachel Dawes character. I mean, even in the best of light, like right here, where she apologizes and seems more likable, I'm just really indifferent to her. But again, this is not a slight against this movie. I still love this movie with all my heart. I still consider it a masterpiece. And now, even though Bruce gets Rachel's respect, she decides that she can't basically be with him romantically because he's Batman. He's Batman. And Bruce Wayne is the actual mask. And Batman is the real man. Batman is the real guy that exists. And she basically says that the man that she loved, the one that she grew up with, he never returned from his 7-year hiatus. And I love that. I love this ending. I thought it was great. And basically, she reiterates to Bruce that she could be with him only up to that point. Or basically, she could be with him when the time comes where Gotham no longer needs Batman. In other words, that's when they can be together. And basically, Batman becomes this public hero, and Jim Gordon and him have this great relationship, and he's been promoted to lieutenant. And it's all great stuff because now the bat signal is going to be implemented, and the film, basically the last shot of the film, or not the last shot, but the setup to the next film, is we see that the Joker is coming. And Jim Gordon basically tells him that there's this criminal who leaves behind Joker playing cards and he's causing all this chaos in Gotham. And Batman just says he's going to look into it, and he just vanishes into the night. And that's the end of the film. And it was amazing. I love Batman Begins. I think it is a masterpiece. It's one of the greatest comic book movies ever made, and it's a great film. Never mind that it's a comic book movie. Christopher Nolan knocked it out the park with this, and I love this film with all my heart. Thank you guys for listening to this review and in-depth analysis. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and share. And last but not least, one love, people. Take care.